to welcome Professor Judith Butler, Maxine Elliot Professor at the University of California, Berkeley, to UNU-GCM. Professor Butler's work on gender, political philosophy, queer theory sheds far-reaching light on a range of issues that we work on here at UNU-GCM. So thank you for being here. Welcome.
Thank you.
I have a few questions that I will base around the kind of work that we do and around the dilemmas that we face in terms of how we do our work and how we think about it. Here at the United Nations University, we're very aware of the fact that very recently the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that form the 2030 Development Agenda at the UN were recently approved. And so in a sense, we're right now at a point of reflection in terms of how we begin working on a new phase in the history of the UN and the implementation of its goals across the world. And the challenges that we face are many, but if we get it right and if the goals are achieved, then in a decade and a half, the world will be a much kinder place. As academics working in the UN, our role is to analyze, conceptualize, inform, and transmit knowledge gleaned from our research to policymakers who, in a sense, speak a different language and think and act in a different way and through sometimes very different priorities. So this leads me to ask you a set of questions. I'll try and be as brief as I can around some of the key ideas in your work, how they may shed light on how we can deal with some of the challenges that we face here. So to start with, in your excitable speech, you laid out your theory of the Speech Act and of the role of language in constituting the subject. So early on in the book, you say, we do things with language, produce effects with language, but language is also the thing that we do. And it is this last clause that captured my attention, because I'm referring here as well to the point that you made in your guest lecture yesterday about the relevance of conceptual analysis to political endeavor when you started your lecture. Here at UNU-GCM, we're located on the sort of ambiguous contact zone of academia and the world of policy formation. And we have an ambivalent role as well as insiders to the UN, who are also in some sense outsiders to its processes, since ours is the space of reflection and analysis. So my first question to you is about language. How can we reconcile the language of existing power structures, of speech acts that reproduce and reconfirm inequalities and injustices, with the language of justice and ethics? And more to the point, how can we, as academics who inform policymakers, engage in the double move between, on the one hand, the undeniably elitist language of the academy and the equally divisory language of states and policymakers in the present day, with, on the other hand, that of an ethics that foregrounds the precarity of the subjects whose human and planetary rights we are working towards?
Well, that's a great set of questions, and I don't know how much I can say, except that it seems to me that all the different kinds of policies that you are thinking about here, including migration or statelessness, involve naming populations. So just at the very basic level of how we name a population, we can see that there are some very consequential effects depending on which names we use and how we use them. So who are the stateless, or who are the refugees? How do we explain them? How do we refer to them? And I think perhaps there are different levels of discourse that one could think about. On the one hand, popular culture or popular media, which is very often engaging ideas of a crowd, ideas of an invasion, ideas of the non-civilized or the non-European, imagining not the fate of individuals, but large groups of people who threaten to take away a local way of life. So it seems to me that academics and policymakers alike have to think about what to do with that popular language and how perhaps to press against it or to take it apart, and to see that there are enormous fears in the figures of speech that are used, and how those fears can get consolidated into everyday ways of talking about migration or groups that are seeking to pass over the border or even to achieve sanctuary here. It seems to me that one could also find in policy language perhaps some euphemisms or ways of speaking that that makes reference to such people in quick and easy ways. We talked a little earlier about whether they are migrants, whether they're refugees, whether we always know how to distinguish between those two classes. How do we understand them? Are they fleeing? Are they searching for something? Do they all have the same goals, and where are they from? And what prompts them? Is it economic destitution? Is it war? Is it fear of bombardment? Is it fear of authoritarian rule? It matters, I think, why people leave where they are and come toward the borders of Europe. And what are they looking for? Do we have a strong sense of how they want to live here or become citizens or participants in the public life? It seems to me if we break that down and get a more textured understanding of how migration starts and what prompts it and what are the aims and wishes, we're bound to have a less fearful relationship to these various processes of migration than we otherwise would. And perhaps the language we use would be less laden with prejudice or stereotype or vulgar simplification. So I think both academics and policymakers have perhaps an obligation to think a bit more carefully and in more nuanced ways about the populations who are moving toward Europe or already here or waiting on the border. How we think about their histories, their passage, their aims, their wishes, and their rights.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I totally agree with you there. So there is another question I have, which is actually, in a way, quite related to this idea of obligation. Since the events of 9/11, a considerable corpus of your work has gone towards analyzing political and ideological trends in the context of the war on terror. In your work, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you analyze very closely the US-led wars, and you place the focus on the subjects whose lives are deemed not grievable and hence not of import. The violent dialectic that seems to emerge is one between an alliance of states and disposable subjects. So, in terms of obligations, where in this scheme of things, in this global paradigm and dynamic of power mechanisms, does a vast, unique, and multifaceted entity such as the United Nations feature, particularly bearing in mind that the UN both recognizes the sovereignty of member states and also always sees itself as occupying an advisory or mentoring role in the name of justice and human rights. So there seems to me there that this is another, perhaps it has to do with language as well, the language of diplomacy, the language of negotiation and convincing states, but without ever challenging the very notion of sovereignty and the right to adhere to that notion.
I see. Well, let me move back a moment and say a word about grievable lives and how they are produced and reproduced. And then let me move toward the important question you ask about the United Nations and its relationship to the sovereignty of the states who are its members. And On the first issue, yes, after 9/11, I focused on state-led wars and noted that if we follow the newspaper or dominant media coverage of the US bombings in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan, we were always very concerned with the lives of US citizens that were lost. And indeed, we seem to have, through a feat of remarkable imagination, linked the bombings of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon to Afghanistan, and effectively made use of those events to begin a war whose aims were, of course, never altogether clear, and perhaps still are not altogether clear. And if we think about the populations that have been killed in Afghanistan and Iraq, or indeed all the civilians that have been killed by American drones, we realize very quickly that we never do get a sense of who those civilians are, what the permissible level of civilian casualty is in the US drone program. Why is it we're never told about those lives or given a chance to assess whether we think our government should be engaged in the killing of civilians or deciding reasonable margins for civilian death? So that's one very, very important issue. As you know, the United States understands itself as a defender of human rights and as a country that seeks to monitor human rights elsewhere and identify human rights violations elsewhere, but it is very reluctant to see itself as a country whose human rights violations might well be identified by other countries or by international institutions. And that's a very profound problem, since the US is not immune from human rights violations. In fact, we could say that most of its wars are predicated on strategies that calculate the permissibility of human rights violation. But there's, of course, another issue, which is now widespread economic destitution and displacement that is the result of capitalist development and of the accumulation of wealth among fewer and fewer corporations, and the result that more and more people find themselves in highly precarious conditions. And we might ask, what are the rights of those people? How do we start to think about global obligations toward the precarious, or the rights that the precarious or indeed the stateless might have? We can't appeal to sovereign states who have dispossessed their populations to always enforce those ideas of human rights. But it seems to me that there are at least two issues. One has to do with the destruction of civilian populations. How do we name that crime, and how do we seek to stop it? And then the second, which is economic destitution. And are there economic rights? Are there rights to a livable life? Are there other claims to economic well-being that stateless people or precarious people can make that have some international standing and that call for action on the part of international institutions? I think, as you know, very often human rights NGOs, non-governmental organizations, have greater freedom to name those issues or to call for innovations in international rights and enforcement. The United Nations is in a very complicated position because it does represent its members. It is, in some ways, nothing but the sum of its members, who are, by definition, sovereign states. At the same time, it articulates a set of international laws or international norms that do sometimes have to defy state sovereignty or intervene in intervene in sovereign power. And in that sense, it is either a trans-sovereign or an extra-sovereign power. I think, of course, it's necessary to intervene in sovereign power, but we also have to be careful and make sure that whatever the extra sovereign power might be does not represent the elite few or the will of the elite few, right? Because then a different hierarchy is produced. So I can only say that I see that as an ongoing conundrum for the United Nations.
Yeah. Well, thank you for helping us to sort of at least think through what the issues are, you know. Because it's complicated, and as you say, the UN is the sum of its parts.
Yes.
And it has a charter which is very clear, but clearly, you know, we're a long way from achieving that. And that kind of leads me to ask you my third question, which is really based around the reading of a book that came out recently of a collection of your essays, Senses of the Subject, where you engage in conversations really with a range of philosophers on issues that are kind of together, I suppose. I don't know how to put it, but maybe they explore the idea of an impassioned embodiment, where the senses and the life of affect offer pathways for subject formation and also for the resistance of the subject in the face of historical and political forces. Through the senses, then the subject is something that becomes both constituted and undone. And the life of the senses then becomes a route to possibly transcending the historically inherited matrix within which the self was first located, which for me is an immensely revolutionary idea or proposal. Because in writing of the senses and of sensory perception, as well as sensory wanting or desire, you've also explored the potential of photography, poetry, and other aesthetic representations to reshape and reconstitute the self, and by extension, paradigms of power. Here at UNU-GCM, in our work on migration, we draw not solely from the field, but from myriad representations of and from the migrant, so oral histories, photographic representations, and the many, sometimes very contradictory perspectives of policymakers, NGOs, civil society organizations, and of course, migrants who might have one kind of social or public role themselves. So we hope through this method to infuse research with the perceptions that come from sensory engagement, and also to counter the obliteration of the effective life, of the vulnerability of migrants or of people on the margins. What would you say is the importance of sensory perception, not solely in constituting or reconstituting the self, but also in recognizing a sense of a shared humanity?
Well, I think in Precarious Life, I introduced the idea of a sensate democracy, and I suggest that one problem that I have seen time and again is the division of the world into people who are grievable and those who are not grievable. That is to say, the constitution of a population that may well die or may well suffer enormous injury, but whose status as a population is not really registered as a group of sensate creatures who actually are living this injury or undergoing enormous loss or who have themselves been lost. And I don't imagine that we should all start crying all the time for everybody. I don't think we can do that. But I do think we can invoke a kind of principle of the equal grievability of all creatures. And perhaps I can restrict myself to the human creature here and ask why it is that certain lives are considered to be so profoundly mournable. Their loss is hideous and unbearable. And other lives pass without comment or note. What's the matrix or grid within which that differential grievability is achieved? And by grievable, I don't just mean a relationship to lives that are already lost. I think we can talk about people who are alive who live with a sense of being grievable. If I go, it will matter. And others who live with a sense of not being grievable. In other words, I'm living, but if I were to disappear, there would be no note taken, or there would be no public recognition for this loss, because in some ways I am already lost. I'm living life as someone whose existence does not count as existence. And I think that this happens, this grid, this way of dividing populations into those that are remarkably grievable and those who are ungrievable and unremarkable. I think that happens all the time in our public media, and certainly in the dominant media of major first world powers, especially those who are waging wars or who have a strong economic stake in the reproduction of precariousness elsewhere or within its own working classes or poor. So one answer I have is that we do need not just artworks, although artworks are enormously important, but we do need a cultivation of the senses so that we might be alert to the ways in which our senses have become deadened in relationship to this matrix of grievability, who's grievable and who is not. What does it mean that we do not acknowledge a loss as a loss, or we do not even understand our own responsibility in participating in or in being complicitous with forms of war or forms of economic policy that produce destitution or indeed death as their result? I think that has to be brought to the fore somehow, not necessarily through sensational graphic images, but through a more considered understanding of what the lived meaning of precarity is. You know, we have social science, we have wonderful social science articles that talk about managing populations or telling us about which population is at risk and which is not. But even that idea of population, sometimes it needs to be broken apart and opened up to see what it is we're actually naming with that term. What is it we're effacing with that term? Are there other terms we can use? Are there other ways of making this argument that makes use of visual imagery or makes use of life stories or makes use of interviews or of collaborative projects such that we get a richer sense of whose lives are at stake and what that means.
Yeah.
And maybe I would add, you know, the idea of responsibility, the sense of responsibility that I would accept or that I would argue for, always does require responsiveness. If we become non-responsive, I'm not sure we can become responsible.
Just
And
the ability to respond.
I think keeping the ability to respond alive is a full-time vocation for many of us.
Sure. Thank you very much indeed for that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.